Welcome to the second episode of The Breakout, a podcast all about Dynasty football, all about strategy in Dynasty football, and all about making sure that your team reaches the promised land in fantasy. I'm your host, Abhi Gupta, and this is my co-host, Leo Xia. We're in the midst of fantasy football season, folks, which means that a lot of you are in the playoffs as we're recording this, but it also means that a lot of you aren't. And there are a lot of different moves that people made in order to position themselves to be successful this year. But did all of them pay off? In today's episode, we're going to take a look at some of the moves that people in our fantasy leagues made and whether or not those strategies paid off.
Yeah, thanks, Abhi. So let's jump straight into the first trade that really defined the season for one of the teams in our leagues. And we'll put that trade up on the screen right now. And our goal for this is to kind of provide a perspective of the moves a rebuilding team would make versus moves a potential contender might make when trying to make a playoff push. So let's go into this trade right now. Abhi, you were actually on the receiving end of a couple of draft picks for Alvin Kamara. Do you want to talk about the kind of situations that you were in and maybe Dustin was in?
Sure. So to give you context, this is in a Superflex league, 12-team, half PPR, tight end premium. And this was the first league that I ever played Dynasty in. So to give you context on that means that I wasn't very good. I was coming in with a redraft mindset. And let's just say that I made some, in hindsight, horrible trades. Moving Stephon Diggs, moving A.J. Brown. If I hadn't made those moves, who knows what my team would look like this year. But given that I made some moves that weren't great, it was time for me to really take a hard look at my team and assess whether or not it was in position to win. And, my team was the fourth worst team last year. And with my initial picks, I picked up Jonathan Taylor and CeeDee Lamb. But even with Alvin Kamara on my team, putting up 30 points a game, I was barely cracking 70 points a week. So what good would the RB1 or the potentially RB1 of the fantasy football season do on my team? By the time that I'm competing, Kamara's probably not going to be in his prime. Which means that my window to move him as a 25-year-old receiving back with Drew Brees potentially retiring at the end of this year, now is definitely the time to move him. And I had already acquired a pick from you, Leo, last year, where I moved Ryan Tannehill for a 2021 first-round pick alongside my first-round pick. And I figured, now's the time to overhaul with youth. I have a bunch of young assets from the previous year, and I should move forward aiming to add as much youth and new talent to my team because the current composition wasn't good enough.
Cool, yeah. And I can kind of describe Dustin's situation. He was a team that was arguably one piece away from making a playoff push. He didn't really have any running backs, but he had a good, solid wide receiver core. He had a good, solid quarterback rotation. And, I think it's pretty common that we see a lot of teams, they feel like they're one piece away from winning. If he acquires Alvin Kamara, maybe Alvin Kamara scores enough points to kind of give him a floor for his running back position. So Dustin was a team that had the first overall pick last year. He drafted Joe Burrow, so he had Deshaun Watson, Joe Burrow, Ben Roethlisberger, and Teddy Bridgewater. He had a pretty good rotation. And his only other running back was David Montgomery. And we can put a screenshot of Dustin's team onto the screen here. So going into it, his perspective is like, okay, I'll kind of mortgage my future a little bit. I'll draft I'll trade for Alvin Kamara. And, the playoffs, you go in like 1 week at a time. If you can get lucky for 3 weeks in a row, then you can win a championship. There's so high variance in the playoffs that all you have to do is just have a couple of really high-scoring Alvin Kamara games, and there it is. So definitely a move that made sense for him given his situation in going through the middle of the year.
Yeah, definitely. That makes sense too, because if you look at the team that Dustin's compiled, he's got a bunch of studs that are kind of, at this point what they're going to give you, and they are producing that value. With the first overall pick getting Joe Burrow, he has a baseline number of points that you can expect. And with Alvin Kamara performing the way that he did for the first 3 weeks, which is around the time where we made this trade, this would be giving his team a lot of stability because Alvin Kamara was reliably putting up 20 points a game. And assuming you want to make a playoff push, it really did seem like Alvin Kamara was someone who would provide you a lot of stability on that ship.
So I kind of want to dive into the value that you sold him for. One part of a good rebuilding process is to not sell your players for too cheap, but a team that is making a playoff push is probably not going to trade you that many assets, like an extreme amount of assets. So how did you value Kamara at around 2 first-round picks?
Sure. Well, I think first and foremost, in order to gauge what you can practically get for a player, you need to understand what the market looks like in your own league. And in the 2 leagues that you and I play in, Leo, we have vastly different markets. In the league where we talked about the AJ Brown trade last week, people are moving picks just for fun. I mean, picks are moving left and right no matter what. People are trying to get what they can at whatever cost. But in Champions, the league that you created, Leo, I would say people are a little bit more stingy. People are nickel and diming and making sure that they get as close to whatever the true value is in comparison to other leagues. And that's no knock on Champions, but it is important to know that coming into trade talks. Knowing that people want to get fair value for what they are giving up means that you can't ask for something ridiculous. I can't say, hey, Dustin, give me DK for 2/3. Like, that's not happening, right? If I'm going to come to Dustin for DK, I would need to ask him for something reasonable, right? I would need to offer him 2 firsts at least in order to get the discussion started. And so when I was trying to move Kamara, I had that in mind that, I would probably be lucky to get 3 firsts, even though I think that's what Alvin Kamara is worth right now to a team that's aspiring to win the championship. Getting somewhere between 2 firsts and 3 firsts sounds about right. And when I was taking a look at other deals that happened, in the history of this league, I think the most that had ever been moved in one deal was the Zeke for a first and Will Fuller. So there was no trade that had occurred where multiple firsts were ever moved.
Yeah, you bring up a really important point, is that you really have to look at the economy of your own league and make offers that align with the current market. Otherwise, it's really hard to get trade talks even started. I think a really important thing that a lot of people forget because they see advice on the internet is that people on the internet always say, oh, start low, start your offer low. And then, they'll counter and you'll build up, like you'll reach some middle point, right? I don't think that's necessarily true all the time. I think you have to make a reasonable offer. If you start too low, you're probably not even going to get the trade discussion started. So starting with a reasonable offer, maybe slightly lower than what you think, is a decent way to get those talks started.
And the really interesting part about this too is that, like, when you look at a top 5 player for a given position, there isn't a lot of room to haggle either, right? Like, if I'm coming to you for Carson Wentz, let's say, Carson Wentz is a player that has a really, really large value window based on how you value him and what you think of his situation, where he could end up, whether he has talent. But when you look at someone like DK, when you look at someone like Alvin Kamara, you look at someone like George Kittle, you know what they are, you know what they're going to produce, and you kind of know what the minimum is you have to pay for them. And so that actually makes trade talks a lot easier. So, when I began these trade talks with Dustin and with, I think, several other people in the league, I began at 3 firsts, and I said, does that sound reasonable to you? If someone is wincing or shutting off trade talks at 3 firsts, I probably am not going to get a deal done with you. But if you say, hey, that sounds reasonable, but I'm not willing to pay that, let's talk further, that's probably going to lead to more productive discussion. And so I did start off high at the high end value that I think people were going to pay, but nothing too unreasonable.
Right. That's a good point, that if you wanted to keep the conversation going, you kind of acknowledge that most people either set their price high or they're trying to buy low. You have to keep the communication going. Otherwise, if someone just kind of ghosts you or you ghost them, it's hard to get a deal done when there's no communication.
Yeah, agreed. And what's really interesting about this too is that Dustin wasn't the only one I was talking to. There were several different people who were interested in Kamara. I mean, when you have a top tier player on the market, like, it's not just that do I want to acquire this person or not. It's also like, if I don't acquire this player, who is going to get him, right? Like, maybe it's worth me spending a little extra to make sure that the other player that is competing against me isn't going to get that player. And honestly, with the teams that I was talking with, that's what it seemed like. There was a lot of feeling out. Should I make the trade? Should I not make the trade? This might be a little bit too much, whatnot. Mm-hmm. Ultimately, what ended up happening with Dustin is he said, hey, I think 3 firsts is fine. But ultimately, I'm not willing to give up that much. I was the worst team in the league last year. You can't honestly expect me to give up 3 firsts. Like, I know what it's like to be stuck, and not be good. So can you find something that's a middle ground? And eventually, my price came down to 2 firsts and a third. I said, you know what? That's fine. I want 3 players out of this. And he said, well, I think picks are super important to me. So if you can, throw me another pick, and the pick is, a 4th round pick, I'm good with the deal. And I said, you know what? There is absolutely no point in me shutting down this deal for a 4th round pick. Like, at that point, I'd be nickel and diming. So if someone is asking me to make a deal and the contingency point is a late round pick, and the meat of the contract, the meat of the deal is Alvin Kamara in 2 firsts, you don't want to give up on that because, you don't think you get exact value.
Right. It sounds like you got the deal done because both sides were willing to kind of communicate their different needs, and you're open to the discussion, and you're willing to make a trade. I think a part of it is a lot of teams may feel like, if I make this trade that is mortgaging my future, like I'm giving away 2 firsts, that's a huge deal, and I'm scared to make this trade. I'm scared to make it happen. Like, what happens if it doesn't work out? What happens if I don't make the playoffs? And a huge part of that is, you're trading for Alvin Kamara, but he's still worth 2 firsts. Like, let's say you don't make the playoffs, you go into next season with no 1st round picks, you can still move him. He's still worth relatively the same amount as he was when you traded him. Your assets don't decrease. Ideally they stay the same.
The assumption is that I get a player and that whatever I spent on that player is gone, right? Mm-hmm. And there's no other movement. But I kind of think about it like, Leo, you might be able to relate to this in home buying. Just because I've bought a home and now I've put in all of this capital into owning this property doesn't mean that capital stays fixed. I can still sell the home and either recoup some of the money that I spent or actually end up getting more. And so, I think the beautiful part of Dustin's strategy here is that his team is young, right? So he doesn't need to replace anybody in the near future. So in that way, having Deshaun and Joe Burrow as his QBs, and having, I think you said David Montgomery and now Alvin Kamara, and I think you said he had DK and some other wide receiver. That's a really young core. That's a really solid core, and he's not gonna miss any big ticket windows by giving up 2 firsts. The only window he'd be missing out on is reaching the playoffs and potentially, having Joe Burrow hit his prime and him not having enough talent on his team in order to solidify on that window.
For sure. Yeah, I kind of want to discuss, after this trade happened also. Now that we're kind of into the playoffs, we know that Dustin has missed the playoffs with this trade. So talk us through, like, do you think he won the trade? Do you think Dustin lost out on the trade? Do you think he should have made the trade in the first place?
Well, I think I'm definitely intrigued that he was the one who made the trade. I think that there were a lot more teams that that were a lot more devoid of talent. Considering that Dustin's team is super young, of course, I just made the argument that him trading away his picks makes sense. But if I were him personally, I probably would have kept the picks and just continued to draft young and keep my team kind of like a conveyor belt loaded and continuing and producing. But he chose to go and make a move this year. It didn't pay off, yes, but there were also a set of freak injuries that happened, right? Joe Burrow tore his ACL and a billion other ligaments. And, DK, even though he popped off this year, there are some games where he's just quiet. Next year, you can expect in year 3 a wide receiver is really, really going to show you what his value is. Deshaun, he's had a down year and he's like the QB6. What's he going to be next year? Joe Burrow is going to come back healthier, probably with Penei Sewell, right? He's going to have an O-line. What's he going to be? His team still has another 1 to 2 year window. And if he ultimately decides Alvin Kamara ain't it, he can move him and he can get some of those picks back. I definitely think that the move that Dustin made was ballsy, and for that I commend him. I don't think I would have made the move, but I sure don't knock him for making it.
For sure, yeah. Sometimes in fantasy football, you kind of have to make the risky moves if you want to win.
Would you have made the move, Leo?
Putting me on the spot. I think given his team and his current situation where he went into, I think it was like week 3 or 4 and he was undefeated, I probably would have made the move. There's a lot of things that you can't predict. Obviously, going into the rest of the season, you can't predict injuries. You can't predict players' usage and stuff like that. So given the situation he was in and the information that he had, I probably would have made the same move. Given Alvin Kamara is a top 2 or 3 running back this year, that possibly could have helped him make the playoffs.
I totally forgot that when he made the move before I think week 4 it was, he was undefeated, right? And like at that point it was, I think we had 4 undefeated teams going into week 4, which that's arms race time. That's like, my team is like locked and loaded. I got to make sure that like I have the most, ammunition here. So given that context, yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense too. You're feeling yourself, go for it.
Yeah. Let's dive into our next topic here. I think one of the things we want to talk about is the different trades that we make. And the other thing is, okay, now that we're playing Dynasty fantasy football, our benches are huge, right? How are you supposed to find waiver wire pickups that help you make a playoff push or actually help you produce? Because obviously this year there were players like that, if you picked them up, like James Robinson, for example, you probably made the playoffs because of him, or you made a good push. So how do we find these types of players on the waiver wire, these like undrafted free agents that just kind of slip under the radar?
Yeah, this is one of those golden questions that they ask you across all of fantasy, right? Like, how do I know who to pick up on the waiver wire? Because it's a consistent question that has a moving equation, right? A lot of it has to do with non-quantifiable things, but you can develop that unquantifiable sense by looking at some of the quantifiable assets. Now, what are all these, random high, level things that I'm talking about? Ultimately, Leo and you and I talk about this thing called a gut feeling, right? How do I know or have a hunch that someone's going to pop off? And a lot of it is just understanding context around players, right? You mentioned James Robinson. Well, you knew that Leonard Fournette wasn't showing up to camp, and you know that Doug Marrone is a guy who's no nonsense. You know that the rest of their running backs weren't really guys that, have done anything significant in the NFL. And you also know that there's this rookie coming in. So at that point, right, it's not like you're trading a first for him. It's not like you're trading a starter for him. You probably picked up James Robinson in any given league because you're like, hey, here's a guy who has the potential to explode. And that's just by taking a look at the situation the player exists in. Yeah.
So we see players like James Robinson where the opportunity kind of occurs before the year starts. And to me, that's a fairly obvious dart throw that you would take is like, okay, there's a player leaving and there's a new player coming in. There's obviously a hole in the opportunity. There's only 32 starting running back roles in the NFL. So, I'm going to put some waiver wire budget onto this guy. I think what's not so obvious is, let's say you're halfway through the season or you're like a third through the season, right? And there's still players on the waiver wire that could potentially turn into gems. How do you decide this? And Abhi, I kind of want you to walk us through, because this year in the Superflex Express League, you picked up Robert Tonyan, I believe, and you got him before his breakout game in Atlanta. And so kind of walk us through.
What was that, like week 4 or 5, something like that?
I believe that was week 3. But walk us through why you picked him up in week 2.
Yeah. The beginning of the season feels like forever ago. My gosh. Well, I mean, Leo, you're a huge Packers fan, right? So by nature of, just talking to you, I think I've kind of started following Green Bay a little bit more, and trying to understand, what is Matt LaFleur doing in order to help Aaron Rodgers, right? You've probably got 2 to 3 more years of Aaron Rodgers. And we've known about this guy named Jay Sternberger. We've known about this guy that they drafted, Jose Deguara. We know that they had Jimmy Graham, and at best, these guys performed as low-level tight end 3s, right? None of these tight ends were capable starters. When given, snap counts, they weren't doing anything with it, which really meant that the moment anybody shows up and does something semi-productive, they're going to be the starter. And if someone is semi-productive and becomes the starter, that means they're going to get more snaps, and that means that there's going to be more opportunity for them to remain the starter. And I think, if I remember correctly, when I took a look at the tight end situation for the Packers in week 1, they drafted Jose Deguara, and he played a very, very few number of snaps. But this guy named Rob Tonyan was getting 30 to 60% of the snap count. And he was catching balls. He was getting targets, but it wasn't anything substantial. I think it was in the realm of 2 to 5 targets, right? Each game, he was catching some, and he was scoring touchdowns. But many times at the beginning of the season, people are so enamored with, oh my God, Christian McCaffrey, first game, put up, 35 points. Whoa, first game, Tom Brady looks horrible in this offense. People aren't really paying attention to the waiver wires. And what I was taking a look at was, okay, Robert Tonyan is this guy with a super, super capable quarterback. A quarterback that elevates tight ends. A quarterback that, has had Jermichael Finley and done really well, has done something with the carcass known as Jimmy Graham, right? And nobody's stepping up, but this guy is getting opportunities, a guy I've never heard of. And as his snap counts are going up and his production is going up, he has a lot of potential. And on my team in Superflex Express, I had Tyler Higbee and Hayden Hurst. We thought they were going to do something, but So might as well pick up another guy, and hey, if he outperforms Tyler Higbee, then great, we have a starter. Those are all the components I was taking a look at. But I think one of the other kind of unsung things is hearing about what these guys do in their free time. And that sounds like a super, generic thing to say, but in the offseason, when you hear reports that this guy named Bob Tonyan is working out with George Kittle, oh, okay. I don't know what they talk about. I don't know what they learn about. Hell, they could be picking up 15-pound dumbbells and hanging out. It could be nothing substantial. But you hear the name association and you think, can some of that rub off? And all of those things just led to me saying, you know what? He's worth dropping Donovan Peoples-Jones.
Yeah, that's a good point. You're basically taking all of these little data points that you found. You don't know for sure that this guy is going to hit, but you're taking a bunch of little data points and making an educated guess, right? And, not all of your educated guesses are going to hit. But the more that you take all of these data points into account when you pick up people off the waiver wire, the better chance you have at making a hit. And so I kind of want to dive into one of the misses that you had, which was Dearness Johnson. Because when I watched the game of him when Nick Chubb got injured, he looked pretty good. He was running with conviction. He was making good cuts. Can you walk us through when you picked up Dearness Johnson, what was going through your head?
So for full context, I'm a Nick Chubb owner. And when you own Nick Chubb and you see Nick Chubb get hurt, you're losing a huge part of the production of your team. And I was a little desperate. I was like, well, shit, these guys run with Nick Chubb and they run with Kareem Hunt, and they're both getting pretty significant touches, So it's clear that they're using two RBs. This Dearness Johnson guy seems to be the RB3 on that team, and in the short amount of time that he played against Dallas's defense, I think he had 5 rushes, 95 yards. That's really, really good performance, right? And so given that my starting running back was on the IR, I was trying to claw for any type of production that I could find. And I said, you know what? These guys are probably going to run with 2 running backs still. Why wouldn't they? And when I was looking at the snap counts, I was like, okay, there's a lot of opportunity for Dearness Johnson to take Kareem Hunt's role, and then for Kareem Hunt to take Nick Chubb's role. I'll just say that this was one of my biggest whiffs. This one did not pan out. I actually missed some information at the beginning of the year that also guided my decision making. I thought Kareem Hunt was going to be out of Cleveland next year because he was on a 2-year deal. But I missed the piece of information where he signed a 2-year extension in September or August or sometime at the beginning of the season. Given that, a lot of the value that I thought I was going to get out of Dearness Johnson didn't realize itself. I don't think Dearness Johnson ever got 5 carries in a game after that Dallas game. It all went to Kareem Hunt. And, using the same logic, snap count, potential, situation, the same framework didn't pan out. And I was left with a 3rd string running back and no fab.
Yeah, for sure. I think kind of summarize, not all pickups off the waiver wires work out the way you want them to. I think it's important, though, so you mentioned that you're spending the fab money, and now after you picked up Dearness Johnson, you didn't have any fab money. I'm assuming that you spent a lot of your fab money on him.
Yep. Well, if I were to explain how many dollars I spent on Bob Tonyan versus how many I spent on Dearness Johnson, I think on Robert Tonyan I spent like $15. On Dearness Johnson, I spent the rest of my total. I think it was like $780. Because I was just that sure, and I also was just that wrong.
And this is out of $1,000, right?
Out of $1,000 fab budget. So it just goes to show you that, like, at the end of the day, these waiver wire pickups are guesses. They're lottery tickets, and sometimes they pan out and sometimes they don't. And just the amount of money that you spend on acquiring a player doesn't always translate.
Definitely. Yeah. And I know this is kind of a completely separate topic, but when you go into it and you're spending like $700 on Dearness Johnson at the beginning of the year because you think he has some opportunity, I think these are reasonable bets to make because at the beginning of the year, there are more players on the waiver wire that have the potential to pop off. And, risking like your fab money at the end of the year is worth nothing. No one's giving you draft picks for it, right? So spending all of your fab money during an opportunistic time is a good strategy.
It's like what those announcers say. Those timeouts don't do you any good at home, right? Use them during the game. It's the same thing with the fab money. The same week that I picked up Dearness Johnson, I picked up Tim Patrick for $250. So, it's all about making sure that if you think someone has the potential to hit and you have a need for that on your team, take a shot.
Yeah. And honestly, it's if you hit on one or like at max two of these waiver wire guys in a single league year, if you got James Robinson, you're probably doing pretty well. You're probably pretty happy with that pickup.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So over time, you just kind of like build and develop the gut feeling based on different articles you read, like different, like looking at the snap counts, the targets and stuff like that.
And I don't think you have to end up being one of those people that's like always on Twitter, always reading, the beats and whatnot. If you're just someone who pays semi-attention to the players that you have on your own team, you'll build up an intuition for this. And a lot of my intuition was derived from understanding my own team's composition and understanding where in the league there was opportunity for new players to be acquired. I'm not trying to pick up guys at the top of their craft. I'm trying to pick up guys, for cheap, that will have a lot of ascension in their value.
Yeah, there's a kind of a push in the fantasy football community to be super analytics focused, and say like, oh, this player has like he has breakout ages, blah blah blah. Has this many snaps percentage, blah blah blah, and that's why he's going to be the next like good waiver wire pickup. And I think for a normal person, this is not super accessible. You can probably follow people like this on Twitter and follow their advice, but if you're a normal person trying to build up your kind of gut intuition going into a waiver wire pickup, you don't have the time necessarily, I would say, to go through that entire process. So yeah, you're right. Pretty much you don't have to follow Twitter super closely. Just going through this exercise of looking at all the different data points, looking at the snap percentage, looking at different news articles that come out about this team, looking at the coach's usage of different players, is enough to make a mostly educated decision in fantasy football, at least.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to go about it. Ultimately, when you're trying to build a gut feeling, it all comes from putting yourself out there, and taking chances. And so the moment you see Cortland Sutton go down, go and grab a Denver wide receiver. Who knows? They might pop off.
So that wraps up our second episode of the Breakout Podcast. Hope you enjoyed. I'm your host, Leo Xia, and this is my co-host, Abhi Gupta.
Let's hit the music.